The music had not even reached its second measure when the hand closed around her wrist like a vice. Eleanor Whitmore felt her heart lurch as Lord Pemberton pulled her half a step closer than propriety allowed, his breath thick with brandy, his fingers tightening when she tried to twist free. Around them, the ballroom glittered with candlelight and laughter, oblivious to the small, desperate struggle happening in its very center. "You will dance with me," he said, low and insistent, his smile never faltering even as his grip bruised her skin beneath her glove. "Your father owes my family a great deal, Miss Whitmore. I think it is time you learned to be agreeable." Eleanor's mind raced. She could not cry out. A scene would ruin her more than silence ever could. Her father's debts were no secret among those who wished to use them against her, and Lord Pemberton had made his intentions clear for weeks now, always in corners, always where no one else could hear. Tonight, emboldened by wine and the crush of the crowd, he had finally cornered her, where retreat seemed impossible. She scanned the room in a single frantic heartbeat, searching for her aunt, for anyone who might intervene. But the crowd had shifted, and she was, for one terrible moment, entirely alone with him. Her eyes fell on a man standing a few feet away, apart from the swirl of dancers, his back straight and his expression unreadable. She recognized him instantly, as did everyone in the room, though few dared look at him directly. Alaric Vaughan, Duke of Ashcombe, stood near the edge of the ballroom like a statue carved from winter itself. Tall, dark-haired, and famously silent, he was a man whose name alone could quiet a room. It was said he had not danced in 3 years. It was said he had not smiled in longer. It was said, though never to his face, that his heart had frozen the day his younger brother died, and that no woman since had come within an arm's length of him without being met with a look so cold it could still a heartbeat. No woman had ever dared touch the Duke of Ashcombe. But in that instant, with Lord Pemberton's fingers digging into her wrist, and panic rising in her throat like floodwater, Eleanor did not think of reputation or rumor. She thought only of escape. She pulled free of Pemberton with a sudden twist, stumbled 2 steps sideways and reached out. Her gloved hand landed on the Duke's arm. The effect was immediate and absolute. Conversation near them did not merely quiet, it stopped. A violinist faltered mid-note before catching himself. Heads turned in a slow, rippling wave, as though the entire room had been struck by the same silent lightning. Eleanor felt the eyes of 100 strangers land on her all at once, and for a single, suspended second, she was certain she had made the greatest mistake of her life. The Duke went rigid beneath her touch. She saw it happen, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, the flicker of something sharp and startled in his gray eyes before it vanished behind the same composed mask he wore for the world. He did not pull away. He did not recoil, though every instinct in the room seemed to expect that he would. Instead, he turned his head slowly and looked down at her, at the small gloved hand resting on his sleeve as though it belonged there. "Forgive me," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. Her fingers trembled against the fine wool of his coat. "I did not know where else to turn." For a long moment, he said nothing. She could feel the weight of his gaze, could see the calculation behind his eyes as he took in her flushed cheeks, the faint red marks already forming where Pemberton's fingers had gripped her wrist, and the man himself, now standing several feet away with an expression caught between fury and disbelief. Then the Duke did something no one in that ballroom expected. He covered her hand with his own. It was the barest gesture, his palm settling over her fingers as though to still their trembling. But it was enough. It was more than enough. A collective breath seemed to catch across the room. Eleanor looked up at him, startled, and found his expression had not softened, exactly, but it had changed. There was nothing warm in it, but there was nothing cruel either. He looked, she thought, like a man reassessing a puzzle he had believed solved. "Lord Pemberton," the Duke said, his voice carrying easily across the sudden hush, calm and level, in a way that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting ever could. "I was not aware Miss Whitmore had promised this dance to you." Pemberton's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "Your Grace, She has not," the Duke continued, as though the man had not spoken at all. "She has promised it to me." The words landed like a verdict. Eleanor felt the room shift around her, felt the weight of 100 assumptions rearranging themselves in an instant. The Duke of Ashcombe, who had not danced in 3 years, who allowed no woman near him, was claiming a dance with a woman half the room did not even recognize by name. Pemberton opened his mouth as if to argue, thought better of it beneath the Duke's unblinking stare, and instead offered a stiff, resentful bow before retreating into the crowd. Eleanor watched him go with a dizzying mixture of relief and disbelief, her hand still resting against the Duke's arm, still held gently beneath his own. "You need not have done that," she said quietly, once Pemberton had vanished from sight. "I am grateful, truly. But I did not mean to draw such attention to you." "You didn't," the Duke replied. "You drew attention to yourself. I simply decided not to correct the impression." There was something almost wry in the way he said it, though his expression remained carefully neutral. Eleanor searched his face, trying to understand a man the entire ton had spent years failing to understand. Up close, he was younger than the story suggested, though there was a weariness around his eyes that no amount of youth could disguise. He looked, she thought, like a man who had trained himself to feel nothing so thoroughly that he had nearly succeeded. "Shall we dance, then?" he said, though it was less a question than an acknowledgement of the situation they now found themselves in. "Since it seems the room has already decided we shall." Eleanor's throat tightened. She was acutely aware of every eye still fixed upon them, of the whispers already beginning to stir at the edges of the ballroom like wind through dry leaves. To decline now would be its own scandal. To accept was to step into a story far larger than the one she had intended to tell. "Yes," she said finally, "thank you." He led her onto the floor, and the musicians, after a beat too long of stunned silence, resumed their song. Eleanor felt every step as though she were walking across ice that might crack beneath her at any moment. The Duke's hand at her waist was light, correct, entirely proper, and yet she could feel the tension in it, the careful control of a man doing something he had not permitted himself to do in a very long time. "You are shaking," he observed, quietly enough that only she could hear. "I have just had a rather eventful evening," she admitted. The faintest ghost of something crossed his mouth, not quite a smile, but its distant cousin. So it would seem. They moved through the steps of the dance in silence for a time, though it was not the silence Eleanor expected. It did not feel cold, it felt, strangely, like the held breath before a door opens. She stole a glance upward and found him already watching her, his gray eyes unreadable but no longer distant, and she understood, with a small jolt of surprise, that whatever she had set in motion tonight, it was not going to end with the final note of this dance. Across the room, half hidden behind a cluster of feathered fans, a woman in deep emerald silk watched the pair with narrowed eyes and a slow, calculating smile. Lady Cordelia Fenwick had spent 2 seasons positioning herself for exactly the match now unfolding before her, and she did not intend to watch it slip away because of some nobody in gray muslin who did not even know how to curtsy properly. The music swelled. Eleanor did not know it yet, but the touch that had saved her from one danger had placed her directly in the path of another, far more dangerous, and far more determined to see her gone. The dance carried them past the tall windows overlooking the garden, and for a moment the candlelight caught the Duke's face at an angle that softened the hard lines of his jaw. Eleanor found herself studying him, despite every instinct that told her to keep her eyes lowered, as a proper young woman ought. There was something in the careful way he held himself, as though any sudden movement might shatter a control he had spent years perfecting. "You are staring," he said, without looking at her directly. "I apologize," she said quickly, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I have simply never—" She stopped herself before the sentence could finish, aware of how it might sound. "Never what, Miss Whitmore?" "Never spoken to you before tonight," she said, choosing the safer truth. "Only heard of you." "And what have you heard?" The question was posed lightly, but she sensed the weight beneath it, the way his shoulders had gone a fraction stiffer beneath her hand. She considered lying, offering some polite nothing about his reputation for fairness or his standing among the peerage. Instead, some reckless honesty, born perhaps of the fright still coursing through her, made her answer plainly. "That you do not dance, that you do not smile, that no woman has touched your sleeve in 3 years without being frozen where she stood." She paused. "I confess I did not entirely believe the last part, until tonight, when I discovered I might test it myself out of sheer desperation. For a moment she feared she had gone too far, that she had trespassed into territory no stranger, however desperate, had any right to enter. But then the corner of his mouth moved again, more definitely this time, something that might almost have been called amusement if it had been permitted to grow any further. "And did I freeze you where you stood?" "No," she admitted. "You warmed my hand instead, which I did not expect." He said nothing to that, but she felt his hand tighten fractionally at her waist, as though her words had struck somewhere he had not anticipated being struck. The dance drew to its close far sooner than Eleanor expected, the final notes settling over the ballroom like a held breath finally released. Around them, polite applause rippled through the crowd, though beneath it she could hear the low hum of whispered speculation, already spreading from group to group like sparks catching dry grass. The Duke stepped back and offered the smallest, most correct of bows. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Whitmore." "Thank you for the rescue, Your Grace," she replied, dropping into a curtsy that felt far steadier than she had any right to feel. He held her gaze a moment longer than propriety strictly required, as though weighing something he had not yet decided to say. Then, with a slight incline of his head, he turned and walked from the floor, leaving her standing alone amid a room full of eyes that had not stopped watching since the moment her hand had first touched his sleeve. Her aunt found her only seconds later, breathless and wide-eyed, having pushed through the crowd the moment she heard the commotion. "Eleanor," she whispered urgently, gripping her arm, though far more gently than Pemberton had. "What in heaven's name did you just do?" Eleanor opened her mouth to explain, though she was not entirely certain she understood it herself. "I do not know," she admitted quietly. "I only know I could not have done anything else." Across the room, Lady Cordelia Fenwick lowered her fan and turned to the woman beside her, her voice honeyed and cold in equal measure. "Find out who she is," she murmured. "Everything about her. Where she comes from, who her father owes money to, and precisely how much." Her eyes did not leave Eleanor as she spoke. "I intend to know exactly what I am dealing with before the week is out." The candles burned lower, the orchestra began a new song, and Eleanor Whitmore, who had walked into that ballroom as a woman no one troubled to remember, walked out of it as a name that would not soon be forgotten. She did not yet know the cost of what she had done, nor the man whose careful, guarded heart she had just, however briefly, touched. She knew only that for the first time in longer than she could recall, she had not felt afraid standing beside another person, and that unfamiliar warmth frightened her far more than Lord Pemberton's grip ever had. By the time Eleanor's carriage rattled to a stop outside her father's modest townhouse, the story had already outrun her. She learned this the following morning, when her aunt burst into the breakfast room clutching a folded note as though it might bite her. "It is everywhere," she said, dropping into a chair without waiting to be invited. "Every drawing room in London is speaking of nothing else. The girl who touched the Duke of Ashcombe. Some say you fainted into his arms, others say you demanded the dance yourself, bold as brass. One particularly inventive account has you weeping at his feet and begging his protection." Eleanor set down her teacup with great care, though her hand was not entirely steady.
"None of that happened."
"It does not matter what happened," her aunt said, not unkindly. "It matters what is said, and what is said, my dear, is that you are now the most talked about woman in London, for better or for worse." Her father, seated at the head of the table, said nothing at all, though the tightness around his mouth told Eleanor everything she needed to know. Mr. Whitmore had spent the better part of a year avoiding his creditors through careful smiles and carefully worded promises, and a daughter suddenly thrust into the center of society's gossip was not a complication he had budgeted for, in coin or in nerve. "Lord Pemberton called this morning," he said at last, his voice tight. "Before you had even risen, he was not pleased." "I imagine not," Eleanor said, "given that he tried to force my hand at the ball, and was publicly refused for it. He is saying you humiliated him." "He humiliated himself the moment he gripped my wrist hard enough to leave a mark," she said, and pulled back her sleeve without thinking, revealing the faint purple bruise still visible beneath her skin. Her aunt's sharp intake of breath was answer enough. Her father looked away, jaw working, though whether from anger at Pemberton, or the impossible position his own debts had placed his daughter in, Eleanor could not say. "We cannot afford his enmity," her father said finally, quietly, "nor can we afford to ignore the interest of a duke, however it came about. Do you understand what I am telling you, Eleanor?" She understood perfectly. She was no longer simply his daughter. She was a piece on a board now, moved by a single desperate gesture into a position neither she nor her family had chosen, surrounded by players far wealthier and far more ruthless than she had ever had to contend with before. The summons came 2 days later, delivered by a footman in fine livery who left no room for refusal. The Duke of Ashcombe requested the pleasure of Miss Whitmore's company for tea, at his townhouse, at 4 o'clock precisely. Eleanor read the card 3 times before she fully believed it, and spent the hours before her departure rehearsing explanations she suspected she would never have the composure to deliver. His townhouse was as commanding as its owner, all dark stone and tall windows, though inside it felt strangely hollow, as though the grandeur had been built to be admired rather than lived in. A stern-faced housekeeper led her through corridors lined with portraits of unsmiling ancestors before showing her into a drawing room, where the Duke stood waiting near the window, his back to the door. "Miss Whitmore," he said, turning as she entered, "thank you for coming." "I was not entirely certain I had a choice, Your Grace." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. You always have a choice. I would not have insisted otherwise. He gestured toward a chair near the fire. Please, sit. She sat, arranging her skirts with more care than the moment strictly required, using the small task to steady her nerves. He remained standing a moment longer before taking the seat opposite her, his posture as rigid and correct as it had been on the ballroom floor 2 nights before. I wish to ask you something, he said, and I find I would prefer honesty to politeness, if you are willing to give it. I generally prefer honesty myself, she said. It has caused me a great deal of trouble, but I have not yet learned to abandon it. The faintest hint of that almost smile returned. Then tell me plainly, why did you take my arm that night? Not the story you have no doubt been asked to repeat for every curious matron in London. The truth. Eleanor considered deflecting, offering some smoothed-over version of events that would satisfy propriety without exposing the full ugliness of what Pemberton had attempted. But something about the directness of his gaze made pretense feel not only difficult but somehow unworthy of the question. Lord Pemberton had gripped my wrist hard enough to bruise it, she said. He intended to force a dance from me, and worse, I believe, before the evening ended, using my father's debts as leverage. I could not call out without ruining myself entirely. You were the nearest person standing apart from the crowd, and I did not think. I simply reached for the first solid thing within reach, and hoped it would hold. And it held, the Duke said quietly. It held, she agreed, though I do not think either of us expected it to. He was silent for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that might have been unsettling had it not felt, strangely, like the first time anyone in London had truly looked at her, rather than through her. Pemberton is a coward and worse, he said finally. I have known men like him my whole life. They mistake desperation in a woman for permission. You speak as though you have seen this before. Something shuddered behind his eyes, quick and complete, like a door closing on a room she had not been invited to enter. I have seen a great many things, he said, which was no answer at all, and they both seemed to understand it as such. Tea arrived, and for a time they spoke of smaller things, safer things, though Eleanor found herself watching him even as they discussed nothing of consequence, trying to reconcile the cold, distant figure the tongue whispered about with the man now pouring her tea with careful, deliberate hands. He asked about her family, and she gave careful, guarded answers. He did not press further than she allowed, which she noted, and appreciated more than she expected to. May I ask you something in return, Your Grace? He inclined his head, granting permission. They say you have not danced in 3 years. They say a great deal about why, though none of it agrees with itself. She hesitated. I do not ask to pry, only because I find myself curious what truth looks like, coming from you, rather than from a drawing room full of strangers. For a long moment she thought he would not answer at all. His jaw tightened and his eyes drifted toward the window, toward some point far beyond the glass that she suspected had nothing to do with the garden outside. My younger brother died 3 years ago, he said finally, his voice carefully flat, as though flatness were the only way he could bear to say it at all. A riding accident, they called it, though the truth was more complicated than that, and not mine to share in full. I was dancing at a ball very like the one 2 nights past when I received the news. I have not danced since. Eleanor's chest tightened with an ache she had not expected to feel for a man she barely knew. I am sorry, she said simply, without embellishment, sensing that anything more would feel like an intrusion. You are the first person in 3 years who has not tried to comfort me with more words than that, he said. I find I prefer your version. They sat in a silence that no longer felt uncomfortable, 2 people who had each, in their own way, been forced into corners they had not chosen, finding some unexpected steadiness in the other's company. When at last Eleanor rose to leave, the Duke walked her to the door himself, waving away the housekeeper who moved to intercept. The gossip will not fade quickly, he said, as her carriage waited at the curb. I am afraid I have made it worse, rather than better, by receiving you here. I do not regret it, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. Nor do I, he said, and though his expression remained composed, something in his eyes had softened in a way she suspected very few people had ever been permitted to see. Good day, Miss Whitmore. She rode home, turning his words over and over, aware that whatever had begun in that ballroom was no longer a matter of scandal alone. It had become something far more dangerous to her heart, and far harder to walk away from, than any rumor London could invent. She did not see the carriage that had idled a short distance down the street throughout her entire visit, nor the woman inside it who watched her emerge with an expression of cold, calculating fury. Lady Cordelia Fenwick had waited 3 years for the Duke of Ashcombe to notice her at all, and she was not about to lose him now to a penniless nobody who had simply been standing in the right place at the right moment. She rapped sharply on the roof of her carriage and ordered her driver onward, her mind already turning over the first threads of a plan far crueler than mere gossip. That evening, Eleanor's father called her into his study, a small, dim room lined with ledgers he no longer allowed anyone else to open. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, sensing already the shape of the conversation before he began it. "You went to the Duke's townhouse today," he said. "It was not a question." "I did. He invited me for tea. The whole street will know it by morning, if they do not already." He rubbed a hand over his face, looking older in that moment than she had ever seen him look. "Eleanor, I will not pretend I understand what is happening between you and the Duke of Ashcombe, but I would be a poor father if I did not tell you plainly what our situation is." "I know our situation, father." "Do you?" His eyes met hers, weary and pleading in a way that made her chest ache. "Pemberton's family holds notes against this house that I cannot repay within the year. If he chooses to call them, we lose everything. The house, what remains of your mother's jewelry, any hope of a future for you or your sisters. I have kept this from you as long as I could because I did not wish you to feel the weight of it. But you felt it anyway, at that ball, when you understood exactly what accepting his hand might have meant." Eleanor's throat tightened. She had suspected the depth of their troubles, but hearing it spoken aloud, so plainly, made the danger feel closer than it ever had before. "And now the Duke has taken an interest instead," she said slowly. "You wish to know if it is real, or if it is a passing curiosity that will leave us worse off than before." "I wish to know if you are prepared for either outcome," her father said, "because Cordelia Fenwick's family is not a house you wish to make an enemy of, and I have heard already, through channels I would rather not name, that she does not intend to lose the Duke without a fight." Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, staring into the low fire crackling in the grate. She thought of the Duke's face as he had spoken of his brother, of the rare, unguarded honesty in his voice, of the strange, steadying calm she had felt sitting across from him despite every reason she had to feel afraid. "I am not seeking his fortune, father," she said finally. "I did not reach for his arm because I saw a Duke standing there. I reached for it because it was the only steady thing in the room." Her father's expression softened, though the worry did not leave his eyes. "I believe you," he said. "I only hope the rest of London is willing to believe it as easily." The rest of London, as it turned out, was not. Over the following days, Eleanor found herself the subject of a scrutiny she had never experienced before, and hoped never to experience again. Invitations that had once ignored her now arrived in a steady stream, though she suspected most came from curiosity rather than genuine welcome. Women she had never spoken to approached her at the milliner's shop with pointed questions disguised as pleasantries. A caricature appeared in one of the more scandalous broadsheets, depicting her as a grasping creature clinging to a stone-faced Duke, and though her aunt tried to keep it from her, Eleanor found a copy folded beneath her breakfast plate before the week was out. She bore it as best she could, though the weight of constant observation began to wear on her in ways she had not anticipated. It was during one such outing, 3 days after her visit to the Duke's townhouse, that she encountered Lady Cordelia Fenwick directly for the first time. They met outside a dressmaker's shop on a fashionable street, Eleanor emerging just as Cordelia's carriage drew to a stop at the curb. The other woman stepped down with practiced grace, her green eyes finding Eleanor instantly, as though she had been watching for her all along. "Miss Whitmore," Cordelia said, her voice smooth as poured cream. "How fortunate, to finally meet the woman all of London cannot stop discussing." "Lady Cordelia." Eleanor dropped into the correct curtsy, keeping her expression carefully neutral despite the way her pulse had quickened. "I confess I did not expect the honor, nor did I expect to find myself curious about a stranger," Cordelia said, stepping closer, her tone still pleasant, though something colder moved beneath it. "But you have made yourself rather difficult to ignore, haven't you? Touching a Duke who has not permitted a single woman near him in 3 years. Quite the accomplishment, for a girl with no fortune and no name to speak of." "I did not touch him for accomplishment's sake," Eleanor said evenly. "I was frightened, and he happened to be near." "How convenient," Cordelia said, her smile never wavering. "And how convenient that a frightened girl should happen to land in the arms of the wealthiest Duke in England, rather than any of the dozen other gentlemen present that evening." She stepped even closer, lowering her voice so that only Eleanor could hear. "I have known Alaric since we were children, Miss Whitmore. I understand him in ways a woman of one dance and one tea cannot begin to grasp. Whatever fleeting curiosity he feels for you now will fade, as such things always do." I would advise you to enjoy it while it lasts, and to prepare yourself gracefully for when it ends. I have no expectations to be disappointed, my lady, Eleanor said, though her heart beat hard against her ribs. I wish the Duke nothing but whatever peace he chooses for himself. How noble, Cordelia said, though the word came out sharp as a blade. We shall see how long that nobility lasts. She swept past Eleanor without another word, leaving behind only the sharp scent of her perfume, and a cold certainty settling in Eleanor's stomach that the woman's warning had not been idle. Eleanor walked home slower than usual that afternoon, turning the encounter over in her mind. She was not naive enough to believe Cordelia's warning came from concern. There had been something calculating beneath the polished surface, something that told her this was only the opening move in a much longer game. Whatever the Duke of Ashcombe had begun that night in the ballroom, Eleanor understood now that she would need far more than honesty and a steady hand to see it through. The letter arrived on a gray morning, sealed with the crest of a house Eleanor's family could not afford to offend, and it changed the shape of everything that followed. Lord Pemberton was calling in his notes, all of them, at once, with a demand for payment within the month that her father had no possible means of meeting. Eleanor read the letter twice over her father's shoulder, feeling the floor of her carefully composed world tilt beneath her feet. This was not the slow ruin they had feared and prepared for as best they could. This was a blade brought down swiftly, deliberately, timed with a precision that felt anything but coincidental. He is punishing us, her father said quietly, setting the letter down with hands that trembled slightly. For the ball. For the refusal in front of half of London. He is punishing me, Eleanor corrected, guilt rising sharp and sudden in her chest. This is because of what happened between us that night. Her father did not argue the point, which told her everything she needed to know about how dire their circumstances truly were. Within the month, they stood to lose the house, whatever remained of value within it, and any hope of a respectable future for Eleanor or her two younger sisters, who did not yet understand the danger closing in around their family with such quiet, ruthless efficiency. Eleanor did not sleep that night. She lay awake turning over every possible solution, each one more impossible than the last, until finally, near dawn, she rose and wrote a single short note, sealed it before she could talk herself out of it, and sent it by messenger to the townhouse of the Duke of Ashcombe. He received her within the hour of her arrival, his expression grave as he read the letter she placed in his hands, the one from Pemberton's solicitor detailing the sudden, ruinous demand. This is retaliation, the Duke said, his voice low and controlled in a way that somehow conveyed more fury than shouting ever could. For the ball, for being refused in front of witnesses. I believe so, yes. He set the letter down with deliberate care, as though handling it roughly might cause the damage within it to spread further than it already had. I will settle the debt myself. Eleanor's head came up sharply. I did not come here to ask that of you, Your Grace. I came only because I did not know who else might understand the situation, or advise me on how to face it. I am aware you did not ask, he said. I am offering regardless. I cannot accept charity from a man I have known less than a fortnight, she said, pride and desperation warring visibly across her face. It would ruin what little reputation remains to me entirely, and it would place my family in a debt to you, far larger than the one we already carry to Pemberton. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something working behind his composed expression that she could not quite name. Then let us call it something other than charity, he said finally. Marry me. The words landed in the quiet room like a struck bell, and for a moment, Eleanor was certain she had misheard him entirely. I beg your pardon? Not for romance, he said quickly, though something in his tone suggested the correction cost him more than he intended to reveal. Not yet, at least. For protection, for practicality. A duchess is not so easily threatened as a merchant's daughter with an unpaid debt. Pemberton cannot touch you, and by extension, cannot touch your family, if you stand beneath my name and my protection. Eleanor's mind reeled, torn between the sheer relief such an offer promised, and the deep, uncomfortable awareness of what it would mean to accept it. You barely know me, she managed finally. I know that you did not seek my fortune, he said. I know that you speak honestly, even when it costs you comfort to do so. I know that in the space of 2 conversations, you have made me feel less like a ghost haunting my own house than I have felt in 3 years. I do not offer this lightly, Miss Whitmore, but I do not see a better solution before us, and I suspect, if you are honest with yourself, neither do you. Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling over her like a heavy coat. She thought of her father's trembling hands over the letter that morning, of her sister's unknowing laughter drifting up from the nursery, of the quiet, unexpected steadiness she had felt in this very room only days before, "If I accept," she said slowly, "it must be understood between us plainly. I will not pretend to a love I do not yet feel, and I will not ask you to pretend either. Whatever this arrangement becomes, let it begin honestly, or not at all." "Agreed," the Duke said, and something in his gray eyes eased, as though her insistence on honesty had settled some doubt he had not voiced aloud. "Honestly then, however this ends." The announcement, when it came, sent a fresh wave of astonishment rippling through London society, louder even than the scandal of the ballroom that had begun it all. The Duke of Ashcombe, who had shown no interest in matrimony in the 3 years since his brother's death, was to marry a woman society had, until a fortnight ago, scarcely known existed. Pemberton's notes were quietly settled within days. The threat against Eleanor's family dissolved as swiftly as it had arrived, though the manner of its resolution only fed the flames of gossip further. Eleanor found herself swept into a whirlwind of preparation, fittings, and social obligations she had never before been required to navigate, each one a fresh trial of nerve. The Duke, to her quiet surprise, made himself present for far more of it than she expected of a man reputed to avoid society at every opportunity. He escorted her to calls, sat beside her at the opera, and walked with her through Hyde Park at the fashionable hour, his presence a steady, deliberate statement to anyone who dared question her place at his side. It was during one such walk, beneath the shade of ancient elms with the city's fashionable crowd drifting past in curious clusters, that Eleanor began to see past the careful composure the Duke wore like armor. "You need not walk so close to me," she said, half teasing, as his hand settled briefly at the small of her back to guide her around a puddle left by the morning's rain. "I am capable of avoiding water on my own, Your Grace." "Alaric," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "My name," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "is Alaric. If we are to be married, I would prefer you use it. Your Grace makes me feel as though I am being addressed by my own solicitor." Something warm unfurled in Eleanor's chest at the small, deliberate offering. "Alaric, then," she said carefully, testing the shape of it, "though you must permit me to keep calling you Your Grace when you are being especially difficult." The corner of his mouth lifted, unmistakably this time, a real and full smile breaking briefly across features she had only ever seen composed into careful neutrality. "I believe I can permit that." They walked in comfortable silence for a time, and Eleanor found herself studying him again, as she often did, searching for the cracks in the careful control he maintained so consistently. She had begun to notice small things over the past days. The way his hand tightened almost imperceptibly whenever his brother's name arose in conversation, the way he watched children playing near the park's edge with an expression of such naked longing that she nearly reached for his hand before catching herself. The way he laughed, rarely, but genuinely, at some dry observation she made, as though the sound surprised even himself. "May I ask you something?" she said finally, as they paused near the edge of the Serpentine, watching the afternoon light scatter across the water. "You may." "Your brother," she said carefully, watching his face for any sign she had overstepped. "What was he like?" For a long moment she thought he would deflect, as he had the first time she asked something adjacent to this same wound. But instead, his shoulders eased slightly, and something almost wistful crossed his expression. "Reckless," he said. "Far more reckless than I ever was, or ever allowed myself to be." He laughed easily, and often, and always seemed to find some way to drag me into his mischief despite my best efforts to remain sensible. He paused, his jaw tightening briefly before he continued. "I was supposed to be with him that day, the accident. I had begged off at the last moment for some business matter I can no longer even recall the details of. I have often wondered whether my presence might have changed what happened." "You could not have known," Eleanor said softly. "No," he agreed, "but knowing that has never quite stopped the wondering." She did not reach for his hand, though she wanted to, some instinct telling her the gesture would feel too large, too soon, for the fragile honesty he had just offered her. Instead, she stood beside him in silence, letting the quiet itself be the comfort, and felt him relax by degrees, as though her simple presence asked nothing further of him than what he had already given. It was in that stillness, unnoticed by either of them, that a familiar carriage rolled slowly past the park's edge, its curtain drawn back just enough for a pair of sharp green eyes to observe the scene with cold, careful attention. Lady Cordelia Fenwick had watched the announcement of their engagement with fury she had barely managed to conceal in public, and watching them now, standing close and unguarded beside the water, she understood with growing certainty that whatever arrangement of convenience the Duke claimed to have entered, something far more dangerous than practicality was beginning to take root between them. She would not allow it to flourish unchallenged. That evening, in the privacy of her own drawing room, Cordelia summoned a woman rarely seen in respectable circles, one whose particular talents lay in discovering secrets others wished kept buried and shaping them into weapons when the price was right. Eleanor Whitmore's family, Cordelia had already learned, carried more than one debt, and more than one secret, and she intended to unearth every last one of them before the wedding could ever take place. "Find me something," Cordelia said quietly, sliding a folded note and a small purse of coin across the table. "A scandal, a lie. If the truth does not cooperate quickly enough, I do not care which. I only care that it reaches the Duke's ears before that girl reaches the altar." The woman across from her smiled, slow and knowing, and pocketed the purse without another word. 2 days later, Eleanor found herself standing in the receiving line of a grand dinner hosted by the Duke's own aunt, Lady Beatrice Vaughan, a formidable woman with silver hair and sharp, assessing eyes, who had summoned them both with a note that admitted no possibility of refusal. "So," Lady Beatrice said, once the introductions had been made and the three of them retreated to a quieter corner of the drawing room before the other guests arrived, "you are the young woman who has managed, in the space of a fortnight, to accomplish what 3 years of my nagging could not." Her gaze swept over Eleanor with frank appraisal. "My nephew smiles again. I confess I did not think I would live to see it." "I have done very little, my lady," Eleanor said, feeling color rise in her cheeks. "I only reached for the nearest steady thing in a moment of fright." "Nonsense," Lady Beatrice said briskly. "Steadiness is not so easily found as you suggest, nor is it so easily kept once found. I have watched a great many women attempt to draw Alaric out of himself since his brother's passing. All of them failed within a single conversation. You have managed several, and he has not once retreated to his study to avoid you, which I assure you is no small feat." She turned a shrewd eye toward her nephew. "Do try not to frighten her off with your usual reticence, Alaric. She seems a sensible girl, and sensible girls are not so easily replaced as your solicitors seem to believe." "I shall endeavor to restrain myself, Aunt," the Duke said dryly, though Eleanor caught the faint warmth beneath his tone, the ease with which he bantered with this one relation, in a way she had not yet seen him manage with anyone else. The dinner itself passed pleasantly enough, though Eleanor remained acutely aware of the curious glances cast her way from down the long table, and of one particular guest whose attention felt sharper than mere curiosity. Lady Cordelia Fenwick had been seated, whether by design or unfortunate accident, close enough to observe them throughout the meal, her expression composed into perfect pleasantness that did nothing to disguise the calculation Eleanor sensed beneath it. "Miss Whitmore," Cordelia said, during a lull in the conversation, her voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of those nearby. "I understand your family has faced some difficulty of late. Debts, I believe, rather substantial ones. How fortunate that the Duke's generosity has arrived just in time to spare you all." The table quieted slightly, several guests glancing toward Eleanor with poorly concealed interest. She felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression carefully composed, refusing to give Cordelia the satisfaction of a visible reaction. "My family's affairs are our own concern, my lady," Eleanor said evenly, "though I thank you for your interest in them." "Of course," Cordelia said, smiling thinly. "I only meant to observe how remarkably well-timed such generosity proved to be, almost as though it were arranged rather than earned." Her eyes flicked meaningfully toward the Duke. "One does wonder what a marriage built on such foundations might come to resemble, once the novelty fades." "I would not presume to speculate on foundations I have not been permitted to examine, Lady Cordelia," the Duke said, his voice carrying a quiet edge that silenced the table more effectively than any raised voice could have. "Though I would remind you that speculation, however elegantly phrased, remains speculation." Cordelia's smile did not waver, though something colder moved behind her eyes before she inclined her head and allowed the conversation to move elsewhere. Eleanor felt the Duke's hand find hers beneath the table, brief and reassuring, gone before anyone else could notice, but enough to steady the anxious rhythm of her heart. Later, as the guests began to depart and carriages gathered along the drive, the Duke walked Eleanor to her own carriage himself, his expression thoughtful in the lamplight. "She will not stop," he said quietly, glancing back toward the house where Cordelia's silhouette remained visible through a lit window. "I have known her a long time. She does not accept refusal gracefully." "I gathered as much," Eleanor said. "I do not frighten easily, Alaric. Whatever she attempts, I intend to meet it standing." Something in his expression shifted at her words, a flicker of admiration he did not bother to conceal. "I am beginning to believe that," he said. "It is, I confess, one of the things about you I find myself least prepared for." He handed her into the carriage with careful formality, though his fingers lingered against hers a moment longer than necessary, and as the carriage pulled away into the darkened street, Eleanor found herself smiling despite the uncertainty gathering at the edges of her happiness, aware that whatever Cordelia Fenwick intended to unleash upon them, it had not yet fully arrived. Back at her father's house, Eleanor climbed the stairs quietly so as not to wake her sisters, though she found the youngest, Margaret, still awake and sitting cross-legged on her bed, waiting with the particular patience of a child determined not to miss anything of importance. "Well," Margaret said, the moment Eleanor appeared in the doorway, "did he kiss you?" "Margaret," Eleanor said, though she could not quite suppress her laughter. "Certainly not. It would be entirely improper." "You are going to marry him," Margaret pointed out reasonably. "I think a great many improper things are permitted once one is engaged." "Not nearly so many as you seem to believe," Eleanor said, crossing the room to sit beside her sister, smoothing a strand of hair back from the girl's face. "But I promise you, whatever else happens, our family is safe now. That is what matters most." Margaret studied her for a long moment with the unsettling perceptiveness children sometimes possessed. "You like him," she said. "Not just because he is safe. You actually like him." Eleanor opened her mouth to deny it, then found she could not quite manage the lie, even for her sister's benefit. "I am beginning to," she admitted quietly, "though I have not yet decided what to do about that." "You could simply let yourself," Margaret said, with the effortless wisdom of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid of her own happiness. "That seems easiest." Eleanor kissed her sister's forehead and left her to sleep, but the words followed her down the hallway to her own room, settling somewhere deep in her chest alongside the memory of the Duke's hand finding hers beneath the dinner table, steady and certain in a way she had not expected to want quite so much. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Eleanor had not expected to find so easily. Mornings brought calls from well-wishers she barely knew. Afternoons brought fittings for a trousseau grander than anything she had ever imagined owning. And evenings, more often than not, brought the Duke himself, arriving at her father's house with a regularity that surprised even his own household staff. He did not need to come so often. She told him as much one evening, as they sat together in the small parlor while her aunt dozed in the corner chair, a token chaperone who had long since stopped pretending to listen closely. "I am aware I do not need to," Alaric said, setting down the book he had been pretending to read for the better part of an hour. "I find I prefer to, regardless. Even when I have nothing more interesting to offer than mending or dull conversation about my sister's lessons." "Especially then," he said, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice made her chest tighten in a way she was still learning to recognize. "I have spent a great many years surrounded by people who wanted something from me. My title, my fortune, my name attached to theirs at a dinner party. You want none of those things, and I find that far more interesting than any conversation I have had in London in longer than I care to admit." Eleanor set aside her needlework, studying him in the low firelight. He had changed in small, unmistakable ways since that first night in the ballroom, the rigid composure softening at its edges whenever he sat with her like this, unguarded in a manner she suspected very few people had ever witnessed. "You are staring again," he observed, echoing her own words back to her from weeks before. "I am allowed," she said. "You stare at me quite often yourself." "I do," he admitted, without embarrassment. "I find I have not yet tired of it." The words hung between them, warmer than either of them seemed entirely prepared for, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken as he rose from his chair and crossed the small distance separating them, settling instead onto the sofa beside her rather than the chair opposite. Her aunt stirred but did not wake, and for a moment the room felt impossibly small, impossibly quiet, containing only the crackle of the fire and the sound of their own careful breathing. "May I ask you something?" he said, his voice lower now, less certain than she had ever heard it. "You may. When we first agreed to this arrangement, I told you it was not for romance. Practicality, I said. Protection." He paused, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. "I find I no longer believe that is entirely true, and I did not wish to continue deceiving either of us by pretending otherwise." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "What are you saying, Elaric?" "I am saying," he said carefully, "that somewhere between the ballroom and this parlor, what began as practicality has become something I do not fully know how to name, except to say that the thought of this arrangement ending, once our purposes are served, has begun to trouble me a great deal more than I expected it to." "I feel it too," Eleanor admitted quietly, the words easier to speak than she had feared they would be. "I did not expect to." I thought I would marry you out of necessity, and perhaps, with time and effort, learn to be content. I did not expect to find myself waiting for your visits the way I have begun to." His hand found hers where it rested on the sofa cushion between them, and this time he did not release it after a brief, reassuring press. He held it, his thumb tracing slow, absent patterns across her knuckles, and Eleanor found herself leaning imperceptibly closer, drawn by a warmth she had spent weeks trying not to name. "I have not felt this in 3 years," he said, so quietly she nearly missed it. "I had begun to believe I no longer could. Perhaps you simply needed the right reason to try again," Eleanor said. He looked at her then with an expression so open, so entirely without its usual careful guard, that she felt her breath catch in her throat. For a moment she thought he might close the distance between them entirely, and some reckless part of her hoped he would, but instead he pressed a slow, careful kiss to the back of her hand, his lips warm against her skin, his eyes never leaving hers. "Thank you," he said, "for taking my arm that night. I do not think I have properly thanked you for it until now. You saved me first," she reminded him softly. "Then let us call it an even trade," he said, and the smile that followed was unguarded and real, the kind she suspected very few people in London had ever been fortunate enough to witness. Her aunt woke shortly after, blinking blearily, and declaring the hour far too late for propriety, and the Duke took his leave with obvious reluctance, though not before pressing one more brief kiss to Eleanor's hand at the door. She stood in the entryway long after his carriage had pulled away, her hand still warm from his touch, her heart fuller than she could remember it being in longer than she cared to admit. The following days brought a lightness to their courtship that Eleanor had not anticipated when she first accepted his offer out of desperation. They rode together in the park each morning, weather permitting, and Alaric began, slowly, to speak more freely of his brother, sharing small memories that made her laugh as often as they made her chest ache, with tenderness for the boy he had lost, and the man who still carried that loss so carefully within him. He introduced her to his small circle of trusted friends, chief among them Lord Edmund Hale, a genial man with an easy laugh who greeted Eleanor with such warm, immediate acceptance that she found herself relaxing in his company almost instantly. "He has not laughed this freely in years," Edmund confided to her one afternoon, while Alaric was momentarily occupied elsewhere at the gathering. "I confess I did not think anyone would manage to coax him back from wherever he retreated after his brother's death. You have done what the rest of us could not." "I only reached for his arm at a ball," Eleanor said, though the words felt smaller each time she repeated them, insufficient to capture what had grown between them since. "Sometimes that is all it takes," Edmund said, with more sincerity than his usual easy manner suggested. "The right hand at the right moment, offered by the right person. I am glad it was you, Miss Whitmore, truly." Eleanor carried those words with her for days afterward, a quiet comfort against the whispers that still occasionally reached her from less kind corners of society. Not everyone had embraced the match so warmly. There remained pockets of the ton who viewed her as an opportunist, a nobody, who had schemed her way into a fortune far above her station, and though she tried to let such talk slide past her unheeded, it was not always so easily managed. It was during a garden party hosted by a mutual acquaintance, held on unusually warm afternoon beneath a canopy of blooming roses, that Eleanor first sensed something shifting beneath the pleasant surface of their courtship. She had stepped away from the main gathering to admire a particularly fine arrangement of flowers near the garden's edge, when she overheard two voices drifting from just beyond a hedge, low and conspiratorial. "Cannot possibly be genuine affection," one voice was saying, a woman Eleanor did not recognize. "A man like the Duke does not simply fall for a merchant's daughter after 3 years of mourning. There must be something else at play, something we do not yet understand. Lady Cordelia certainly believes so," the second voice replied. "She has been asking questions all over town. About the girl's family, her father's debts, whether there might be something in her past worth uncovering." Eleanor's breath caught, her hand tightening around the rose stem she had been examining until a thorn pricked her palm, sharp and sudden. She withdrew quietly, her heart pounding. The pleasant warmth of the afternoon suddenly turned cold with apprehension. She had known Cordelia would not simply accept defeat gracefully, but hearing confirmation of it, spoken so casually among strangers, made the threat feel suddenly, uncomfortably real. She said nothing of it to Alaric that evening, unwilling to cast a shadow over the easy warmth that had grown between them, though the unease lingered at the back of her mind for days afterward, a quiet, persistent worry she could not fully set aside. Instead, she found herself watching the edges of every gathering more carefully, noting who whispered behind fans, who fell silent when she approached, who lingered a little too long near her father whenever he attended some function at her side. It was a small, constant vigilance that exhausted her in ways the earlier scandal never had, because that first storm, at least, had been honest in its intensity. This new unease crept in quietly, disguised as pleasantries and polite smiles, and she found it far harder to guard against. Alaric noticed the change in her before she managed to hide it entirely. They were walking through his aunt's gardens one afternoon, the roses in full bloom around them, when he stopped abruptly and turned to face her, his expression unusually serious. "Something is troubling you," he said. "You have grown quieter this past week. I had thought perhaps it was nerves about the wedding, but I do not believe that is the whole of it." Eleanor hesitated, torn between her instinct to protect him from worry and her promise, made weeks ago, to build whatever they had honestly. "I overheard something at the garden party," she admitted finally. "Whispers, about Lady Cordelia asking questions, about my family, about whether there might be something in our past worth uncovering." His jaw tightened, the easy warmth of moments before hardening into something sharper. "You should have told me immediately. I did not wish to trouble you over rumors that may amount to nothing." "Eleanor." He took both her hands in his gray eyes intent on hers. "Whatever Cordelia intends, we face it together, not separately. I did not offer you protection, only to leave you carrying its burdens alone. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said softly, though the knot of worry in her chest did not fully loosen. "Not yet. I only did not wish to be the reason for more difficulty in your life. You have carried enough of that already." "You are not a difficulty," he said firmly. "You are the first good thing to happen to me in 3 years, and I do not intend to let anyone, least of all Cordelia Fenwick, take that from me without a fight." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "Whatever she thinks she might find, Eleanor, I want you to know it will not change how I feel about you. Nothing in your past, real or invented, could undo what has grown between us these past weeks." Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly at his words, and she blinked them back, embarrassed by the sudden rush of emotion. "You cannot know that for certain," she said. "You do not yet know what she might find." "I know you," he said simply. "That is enough for me." They stood together in the quiet garden for a long moment, the weight of the unspoken threat settling between them, even as his words offered what comfort they could. Eleanor found herself leaning into him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, steady and warm, a silent promise that whatever came, she would not face it alone. That night, however, sleep did not come easily. Eleanor lay awake long past midnight, turning over every detail of her family's history that Cordelia might twist into a weapon. There was little enough to find, she told herself. Her father's debts were common knowledge already, stripped of their power to shock. Her mother had died when Eleanor was young, a sorrow but not a scandal. She could think of nothing in their quiet, unremarkable history that might provide the kind of ammunition Cordelia seemed determined to locate. But she had not yet considered how easily a determined enemy might manufacture a scandal where none truly existed, nor how little the truth mattered once a rumor had been set loose among people eager to believe the worst of a woman who had risen, seemingly overnight, above her expected station. She would learn the shape of that danger soon enough, and by then, it would already be moving faster than either she or Alaric could easily contain. The next morning brought a small, unexpected comfort in the form of a note from Lady Beatrice, inviting Eleanor to call upon her alone, without Alaric's presence, an invitation that struck Eleanor as unusual enough to warrant immediate acceptance. She found the older woman in her private sitting room, a cup of tea already poured and waiting, her sharp eyes assessing Eleanor the moment she entered. "Sit," Lady Beatrice said, gesturing to the chair opposite. "I have heard whispers of Cordelia's little investigations, and I suspect you have as well, given the shadows beneath your eyes this morning." "You have heard, then," Eleanor said, sitting carefully. "My dear girl, I have heard a great many things in my lifetime, and I have learned to separate the substance from the noise." Lady Beatrice folded her hands in her lap, her expression softening slightly. "I wish to tell you something, and I wish you to listen carefully, because I do not offer comfort easily or often. Whatever Cordelia finds or invents, it will not matter in the end, because my nephew has made his choice, and Alaric does not make choices lightly, nor does he abandon them once made. I have watched that boy remain loyal to people and principles far less deserving than you for the whole of his life. You need not fear losing him to gossip, however cleverly constructed." "Thank you," Eleanor said, genuinely moved. "I confess I needed to hear that today." "I know," Lady Beatrice said with the faintest hint of a smile. "That is precisely why I sent for you." She reached across and patted Eleanor's hand briskly. Now drink your tea before it grows cold, and let us speak of something far more pleasant than Cordelia Fenwick's petty schemes. I understand you have not yet chosen your wedding flowers, and I have opinions on the matter that I intend to share whether you ask for them or not." Eleanor laughed despite herself, the tightness in her chest easing for the first time in days, grateful for the older woman's blunt, unwavering kindness in a season that had offered her precious little of it from anyone outside Alaric's immediate circle. The scandal broke 3 days before the wedding, spreading through London with the speed and hunger of fire through dry summer grass. Eleanor first learned of it when her aunt appeared at her bedroom door, white-faced and shaking, a broadsheet clutched in her trembling hands. "You need to see this," she said, her voice barely steady, "before someone else shows it to you first." Eleanor took the paper with a growing sense of dread, and found her own name printed boldly beneath a lurid headline, accompanied by a story so carefully constructed it took her breath away. It claimed that Eleanor's mother, who had died when Eleanor was a child, had not succumbed to illness as the family had always maintained, but had instead abandoned her husband and infant daughter for a scandalous affair, only returning years later, broken and ashamed, to die in quiet disgrace. It further suggested, with just enough vagueness to avoid outright legal accusation, that Eleanor herself might not be the Duke's intended bride at all in truth, but a woman who had deliberately engineered the entire ballroom encounter, coached and positioned by her desperate father to entrap a wealthy, grieving Duke into a marriage that would erase their debts entirely. None of it was true. Eleanor knew every detail of her mother's death, had sat beside her sickbed through the final fever that claimed her, had grieved alongside her father in the quiet, private way families do when there is no scandal to hide, only sorrow to bear. But truth, she understood with sickening clarity, mattered little once a story this scandalous had been set loose among people eager to believe the worst. "Where did this come from?" she demanded, though she already suspected the answer. "No one knows for certain," her aunt said, "but everyone is saying it. It has spread through every drawing room in London since this morning." Eleanor's hands shook as she set the paper down, her mind racing through the implications. If Alaric believed even a fraction of it, if the seed of doubt Cordelia had so carefully planted found purchase in a heart already scarred by one great loss, everything they had built together over the past weeks might collapse beneath the weight of a lie. She did not have to wait long to discover his reaction. A note arrived within the hour, brief and formal in a way that struck cold fear into her chest the moment she broke the seal. "Miss Whitmore, I have seen the broadsheet. I require an explanation, and I require it in person. Please call upon me this afternoon. A.V." The formality of it, the absence of her name softened by any warmth, told her more than the words themselves ever could. She arrived at his townhouse with her heart hammering against her ribs, and found him waiting in the same drawing room where he had first asked her honest questions weeks before, though the man standing near the window now bore little resemblance to the one who had smiled at her over tea and confided the truth of his brother's death. "Is it true?" he said, without preamble, his voice carefully controlled in a way that felt colder than any anger could have. "None of it," Eleanor said immediately. "My mother died of a fever when I was 11 years old. I was there. I held her hand. There was no affair, no abandonment, no scandal beyond the ordinary grief of losing her too young, and I did not engineer that night at the ball, Alaric. You know I did not. You were there. You saw what happened." "I saw what I believed happened," he said, and the words struck her like a blow, worse than any accusation could have been, precisely because of how quietly he spoke them. "But I have been deceived by careful appearances before, Eleanor. I have watched people I trusted construct exactly the story they wished me to believe, only to discover the truth far too late to protect myself from it. You are speaking of your brother," Eleanor said slowly, understanding dawning even through her own hurt and fear. "Something happened beyond the accident itself, didn't it? Something you have never told me." His jaw tightened, old grief and fresh suspicion warring visibly across his face. "My brother was engaged to be married, before he died. To a woman who, we later learned, had orchestrated the entire courtship for the sole purpose of securing his fortune, aided by a family desperate enough to fabricate whatever history was necessary to make the match appear respectable. He never knew the truth. He died believing himself loved by a woman who had never felt anything for him beyond calculated ambition." He paused, his gray eyes bright with old pain. "I have spent 3 years guarding against ever being so thoroughly deceived again. And now I find myself faced with a scandal that, however you deny it, echoes that same story with uncomfortable precision." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her, understanding now the true depth of the wound Cordelia's scheme had struck. This was not merely a lie about her mother. It was a lie perfectly, cruelly calibrated to resurrect the Duke's deepest fear, to make her denial sound exactly like the denials he had once believed from a woman who had, in the end, betrayed his brother entirely. "I am not her," Eleanor said, her voice shaking now despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Whatever that woman did to your brother, I had no part in it, and I will not be punished for a betrayal I did not commit, simply because the shape of this lie happens to resemble an old wound you have never fully healed from." "Then tell me who did commit it," he said. "Tell me who invented this story, if not you or your father seeking to secure my fortune through whatever means necessary." "I do not know for certain," Eleanor admitted, "but I have my suspicions, and I imagine, if you search your own heart honestly, you share them." Something flickered across his expression at that, a flash of doubt directed inward rather than at her, though it vanished too quickly for her to be certain of what she had seen. "Cordelia," he said slowly, as though testing the shape of the accusation. "You believe Cordelia constructed this?" "I overheard her associates discussing an investigation into my family weeks ago, at the garden party," Eleanor said. "I did not tell you at the time because I did not wish to trouble you over rumors that might amount to nothing. I see now that was a mistake." She took a steadying breath, forcing herself to meet his eyes despite the fear roiling in her chest. "I cannot force you to believe me over a stranger's carefully constructed lie, Alaric. I can only tell you the truth, as I have always told you the truth. From the very first moment I confessed why I took your arm in that ballroom. If that is not enough for you, then perhaps this arrangement was always more fragile than either of us wished to believe." The words hung heavy in the room between them, and for a long, terrible moment, Alaric said nothing at all, his expression a battleground of grief and suspicion, and something else Eleanor could not quite name, something that looked almost like fear. "I need time," he said finally, quietly, "to think. To determine what is true and what is manufactured, before I commit myself further to a marriage that all of London now believes to be built on deception." Eleanor felt something inside her chest crack at his words, sharp and sudden, though she refused to let the tears gathering at the edges of her vision fall while he could still see them. "Then take your time," she said, with as much steadiness as she could summon. "But know this, Alaric. I did not reach for your arm that night because I saw a fortune or a title. I reached for it because you were the only steady thing in a room full of danger. Whatever you decide, that much has never been, and will never be, a lie." She left without waiting for his response, walking through his grand, hollow townhouse with her spine straight and her chin high, though the moment she reached the privacy of her own carriage, the composure she had fought so hard to maintain finally shattered entirely, and she wept the whole way home. The days that followed were the darkest Eleanor had known since her mother's death. The wedding, scheduled for only 3 days hence, hung suspended in uncertain limbo, neither cancelled nor confirmed, while London's gossip mills churned ever faster with speculation about whether the Duke of Ashcombe would truly abandon his bride at the very threshold of the altar. Her father moved through the house like a ghost, guilt etched into every line of his face, though Eleanor found she could not bring herself to blame him for a scheme neither of them had orchestrated. Her sisters, sensing the tension though not fully understanding its cause, grew quiet and watchful, and even young Margaret's usual boundless chatter fell silent in the face of her sister's evident heartbreak. Eleanor spent those days in a strange, suspended grief, mourning a future she had only just begun to allow herself to want. She had told herself, in the beginning, that this marriage was a matter of practicality, of protection, easily approached without risking her heart too deeply. She understood now, in the aching hollow left by his absence, how thoroughly that careful distance had failed her. She had fallen in love with Alaric Vaughan somewhere between the ballroom and the garden party, somewhere between his careful confessions and his rare, unguarded smile, and the possibility of losing him now, to a lie neither of them had created, felt like a wound far deeper than anything Lord Pemberton's cruelty had ever managed to inflict. On the second night of his silence, as Eleanor sat alone in her room long after her sisters had gone to sleep, a soft knock sounded at her window, startling her from her miserable thoughts. She crossed the room cautiously and drew back the curtain to find Lord Edmund Hale standing in the narrow garden below, his expression urgent in the moonlight. "Miss Whitmore," he called softly, careful not to wake the household. "I must speak with you. It concerns Alaric, and I believe I have found something you both need to see, before this goes any further than it already has." Eleanor's heart leapt with sudden cautious hope, and she hurried to dress and slip quietly from the house to meet him, praying whatever he had discovered might yet be enough to undo the damage Cordelia's careful lies had wrought upon the fragile, precious things she and Alaric had built together. Forgive the hour, Edmund said once she had joined him in the shadowed garden, his breath visible in the cool night air. I did not wish to wait until morning, not when every hour that passes seems to harden Alaric's resolve to keep his distance from you. What have you found? Eleanor asked, hardly daring to hope. A woman, Edmund said, one employed on occasion by those willing to pay for information others would prefer remain buried. I have used her services myself, in the past, for matters far less consequential than this. She came to me 2 nights ago, troubled by her conscience, or perhaps merely troubled by the fear that she had involved herself in something larger than she anticipated. She confessed that Lady Cordelia Fenwick paid her handsomely to construct the story about your mother, weaving just enough truth into the lie to make it convincing. Your mother did suffer a brief illness that kept her from society for a season when you were a child, long before the fever that eventually claimed her. Cordelia's woman twisted that single fact into the foundation of an entirely fabricated scandal. Relief flooded through Eleanor so suddenly that her knees nearly gave beneath her, and she gripped the garden wall for support. Will she testify to this? Will she tell Alaric what she has told you? She is frightened, Edmund admitted. Cordelia's family carries considerable influence, and the woman fears retaliation if her role in this becomes known. But I believe, with the right persuasion, and perhaps the promise of protection from Alaric himself, she might be convinced to come forward. He paused, his expression turning grave. There is more, Miss Whitmore, and I am afraid it will not be easy to hear. The woman also confessed that this was not the first time Cordelia had employed her services. 3 years ago, before Alaric's brother's death, Cordelia paid the very same woman to investigate the family of the young lady his brother had intended to marry, hoping to find some scandal that might end the engagement in her own favor. She found nothing damaging enough to use at the time, but it seems Cordelia has long made a practice of manufacturing ruin for any woman who threatens to claim a match she believes should belong to her. Eleanor's breath caught, a cold understanding settling over her. The woman who betrayed Alaric's brother, she said slowly. The one he believes deceived him for his fortune. You are suggesting that story too. Might not be entirely what it appears. I cannot say for certain, Edmund said carefully. That happened before my closest friendship with Alaric began, and the details remain murky even to those of us who knew him then. But I have always found it strange that a young woman capable of such devotion, by every account those who knew her gave at the time, should suddenly reveal herself as nothing more than a fortune hunter in the weeks before her wedding. I wonder now whether Cordelia's hand was at work then as well, though I cannot prove it, and the girl herself left London shortly after the engagement ended, and has not been heard from since. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, the full, terrible shape of Cordelia's cruelty coming into focus. If Edmund's suspicions held any truth, then the wound Alaric carried, the one that had made him so quick to doubt Eleanor's honesty, might itself have been inflicted by the very same woman now attempting to destroy her second chance at happiness. We must tell him, Eleanor said. Tonight, if possible. He deserves to know the truth, however painful it proves to unravel. I agree, Edmund said, though I fear convincing him will not be simple. 3 years of carefully guarded belief do not dissolve easily, even in the face of new evidence. He has built his entire understanding of trust and betrayal around that story, Miss Whitmore. Asking him to reconsider it now, in the midst of a fresh crisis that so closely echoes the old one, may prove harder than you expect. I do not care how difficult it proves, Eleanor said, steel entering her voice despite the tears still threatening at the edges of her composure. I have not spent these past weeks falling in love with a man, only to lose him to a lie constructed by a woman too bitter to accept her own losses gracefully. Will you help me arrange to speak with this woman directly? I wish to hear her confession myself, and I wish to bring her before Alaric so that he might hear the truth from someone other than the woman he currently believes has deceived him. Edmund studied her for a long moment in the moonlight, something like admiration crossing his open, honest face. I begin to understand why he fell for you so quickly, he said. Very well, I will arrange it, but we must move swiftly, Miss Whitmore. The wedding is only 2 days hence, and I suspect Cordelia will not sit idle while her scheme unravels around her. If she senses discovery approaching, she may attempt something far more drastic than mere gossip to ensure her victory. Eleanor nodded, steadying herself against the cold night air and the colder fear settling in her chest. Whatever came next, she understood now that this was no longer simply a matter of clearing her own name. It was a battle for the truth itself, for Alaric's capacity to trust again after years of carefully guarded grief, and for a love she was no longer willing to surrender without a fight worthy of the courage it had taken to reach for his arm on that very first night. She returned to her room before dawn, sleep entirely out of reach despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. Instead, she sat by her window watching the sky lighten slowly over the rooftops of London, turning over every word Edmund had spoken, every fragile thread of hope now stretched taut between her and the man she loved. 2 days remained before the wedding, 2 days to unravel 3 years of careful, guarded belief and one carefully constructed lie. It was not much time, but Eleanor had learned, in the weeks since that first desperate reach for a stranger's arm, that courage rarely arrived with the luxury of time enough to spare. It arrived more often than not in a single narrow window, demanding to be seized before it closed forever, and she intended to seize this one with everything she had left to give. The woman's name was Hester, and she arrived at Lord Edmund Hale's townhouse the following evening, wrapped in a plain dark cloak, her eyes darting nervously toward every shadow, as though she expected pursuit at any moment. Eleanor sat across from her in the small private study Edmund had arranged for their meeting, her hands folded tightly in her lap to still their trembling. "I did not wish to cause you harm," Hester said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have done a great many things I am not proud of, Miss Whitmore, but I have never before watched the damage I caused unfold quite so plainly before my own eyes. When I learned the wedding might not proceed because of what I wrote, I could not rest easy any longer." "Tell me everything," Eleanor said gently, "from the beginning." Hester's account matched precisely what Edmund had already relayed, though hearing it directly, in the woman's own halting, guilt-laden words, made the cruelty of it land with fresh force. Cordelia had approached her weeks earlier, shortly after the engagement announcement, demanding any scandal that might be found, or, failing that, invented. Hester had discovered the small, true detail of Eleanor's mother's brief illness years before her death, and had woven around it a fabric of lies, elaborate enough to seem credible to anyone unwilling to look too closely. "And 3 years ago," Eleanor pressed carefully, "Lord Edmund believes you were engaged by Lady Cordelia then as well, concerning the Duke's brother's intended bride." Hester's face paled further, and for a long moment, Eleanor feared she would refuse to answer at all. But finally, with a shuddering breath, the woman nodded. "That young lady loved him truly," she said quietly. "I found nothing damaging in her history, because there was nothing to find. When Lady Cordelia realized I had failed to produce a scandal, she took matters into her own hands. I do not know precisely what she did, only that within a fortnight, the engagement had ended, and the young lady had fled London in disgrace, branded a fortune hunter by rumors I did not construct myself, though I have always suspected Cordelia arranged them through some other means I was never made party to." Eleanor felt sick with the confirmation of what she had feared. Alaric's entire understanding of betrayal, the wound that had kept him frozen and guarded for 3 long years, had very likely been manufactured from nothing by the same woman now attempting to destroy his second chance at happiness. "Will you tell him this yourself?" Eleanor asked. "I know you are frightened, but he deserves to hear the truth from you directly, not second-hand through me." Hester hesitated, wringing her hands, before finally nodding with visible reluctance. "If Lord Hale can promise me protection from Lady Cordelia's retaliation, yes, I will tell him everything." Edmund, who had remained quietly near the door throughout the exchange, stepped forward with quiet assurance. "You have my word, and the Duke's resources besides, should you need them. Cordelia's influence, considerable as it is, does not extend beyond what a Duke's protection can shield you from." They arranged the meeting for the following morning, the day before the wedding was meant to take place, though none of them could say with certainty whether it still would. Eleanor spent the night in restless, anxious wakefulness, praying that the truth, once spoken plainly, would prove strong enough to undo the damage 3 years of guarded grief had built into an almost impenetrable wall around Alaric's heart. He received them in the same drawing room where every significant conversation between himself and Eleanor had taken place, his expression guarded and wary as Hester was shown in, trembling but resolute. Eleanor stood near the window, forcing herself to remain silent and let the woman's own confession carry the weight of truth without her interference. Hester told her story haltingly at first, then with growing steadiness as she moved through the account, sparing herself nothing, admitting her own guilt in the fabrication surrounding Eleanor's mother, and finally arriving at the older, deeper wound concerning his brother's broken engagement 3 years before. Alaric had gone very still during this final part of her account, his face drained of color, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as though to anchor himself against the ground shifting beneath him. When Hester finished, silence stretched long and heavy through the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of carriages passing in the street below. "You are telling me," he said finally, his voice rough with an emotion Eleanor had never heard from him before, That my brother's fiancée was innocent, that she loved him truly, and that Cordelia destroyed that engagement out of nothing more than her own jealous ambition. I believe so, Your Grace, Hester said quietly. I cannot prove every detail of what happened after my own involvement ended, but I know I found nothing to justify the rumors that followed, and I have long suspected Cordelia's hand in whatever came after. Alaric rose abruptly and walked to the window, his back to the room, his shoulders rigid with a grief Eleanor recognized instantly, though it had transformed now into something sharper, angrier, directed at a truth he had carried wrongly for 3 long years. My brother died believing himself betrayed, he said, his voice barely audible. He died grieving a love he believed had never been real, and it seems that grief, that belief, may have been nothing more than a lie, constructed by a woman I have called a friend for the whole of my life. Alaric, Eleanor said softly, crossing the room to stand beside him, though she did not reach for him yet, uncertain whether he would welcome the touch in this raw, unguarded moment. I am so sorry. I know this truth costs you as much, perhaps more, than the lie ever did. He turned to face her then, and the expression in his eyes stole the breath from her lungs entirely. Grief, and fury, and something achingly tender all tangled together. I doubted you, he said. I let 3 years of a false grief convince me that you, too, might be capable of the same cruelty, when every honest moment we have shared together should have told me otherwise. I am sorrier for that than I know how to properly express. You were protecting yourself, Eleanor said gently. I cannot fault you for that, not when I understand now what shaped the fear. I nearly let that fear cost me the truest thing to happen to me since my brother died, he said. And this time he did reach for her, his hands finding hers with a desperate gentleness that made her chest ache with relief and love in equal measure. Can you forgive me, Eleanor, for doubting you, even briefly, even with cause I did not fully understand at the time? I already have, she said, and meant it entirely, the last of her own fear and hurt dissolving beneath the raw sincerity in his voice. He drew her into an embrace then, careless of Hester and Edmund still present in the room, holding her as though he feared she might vanish if he loosened his grip even slightly. Eleanor pressed her face against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar warmth of him, and felt, for the first time since the scandal broke, that everything might truly be well again. But the matter of Cordelia Fenwick remained unresolved, and Alaric, once he had steadied himself, turned to Edmund with a hard, determined expression that Eleanor had not seen from him before. She will answer for this, he said. Both crimes, my brother's broken heart, and Eleanor's threatened reputation. I will not allow her to walk away from either unchallenged. The confrontation, when it came, unfolded not in a private drawing room but at a grand ball hosted that very evening by one of society's most prominent hostesses, an event Cordelia herself would certainly attend, believing her scheme still safely concealed. Alaric arrived with Eleanor on his arm, and the whispers that had followed them since the scandal broke shifted instantly into something closer to astonished curiosity, as the couple, rather than appearing estranged, moved through the ballroom with unmistakable unity. Cordelia found them near the refreshment table within the hour, her composed smile faltering only slightly at the sight of Eleanor's confident, unbowed presence at the Duke's side. Your Grace, she said smoothly, I confess I did not expect to see you both here this evening, given the recent unpleasantness. The unpleasantness has been resolved, Alaric said, his voice carrying with deliberate clarity to those standing near enough to hear, drawing curious attention exactly as he intended. I have learned the truth of who constructed the lie about Miss Whitmore's mother, Cordelia. I have also learned, rather more painfully, the truth of what happened to my brother's engagement 3 years ago. Cordelia's face went pale beneath her careful cosmetics, her composure cracking for the first time since Eleanor had known her. I do not know what you mean, she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. I believe you do, Alaric said, quiet and merciless. Hester has confessed everything. Your payments, your instructions, your determination to destroy any woman who threatened to claim a match you believed should belong to you, whether it was my brother 3 years ago, or Eleanor now. His voice rose slightly, enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests, who had already begun to fall silent, sensing the drama unfolding before them. You cost my brother his final months of happiness, Cordelia. You let him die believing himself betrayed by a woman who loved him truly. I do not know how you have lived with that these 3 years, but I assure you, London will know the truth of it before this night ends. The ballroom had gone entirely silent now, every eye fixed on the unfolding scene with the same rapt attention that had once been directed at Eleanor's desperate gesture weeks before. Cordelia looked around at the gathered crowd, at faces that had once fawned over her now watching with dawning, horrified understanding, and something in her composed mask finally shattered entirely. "He never loved me," she said, her voice cracking, the venom finally spilling free after years of careful containment. "Your brother, I loved him for years, quietly, faithfully, and he never once looked at me as anything more than a family friend. And then she came along, that simpering nobody, and he fell for her within a season, while I had waited years for a glance he never gave me. I could not simply watch it happen again. I could not watch her win what I had wanted my whole life, only to lose it to someone who reached for it without even trying." "So you destroyed it instead," Alaric said, quiet fury etched into every word. "Rather than allow either of us happiness you could not claim for yourself." Cordelia said nothing further, her silence itself a confession, and the crowd around them shifted with a low, rising murmur of shock and condemnation. Within days, Eleanor would learn. The story spread through every corner of London society, and Cordelia Fenwick, once among the most sought-after women of the ton, found herself increasingly shunned, her family's influence unable to fully shield her from the consequences of a cruelty finally exposed to the light. But that night, standing amid the wreckage of Cordelia's unraveling scheme, Eleanor felt only the steady warmth of Alaric's hand in hers, and the quiet, certain knowledge that whatever had once stood between them had finally, fully dissolved. He turned to her then, in full view of the entire astonished ballroom, and dropped to one knee with a formality that drew a fresh gasp from the crowd, though this time the whispers carried nothing but wonder. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "you took my arm in a ballroom, not so very different from this one, when I had convinced myself I would never again be worthy of anyone's trust or affection. You have given me back a piece of myself I believed lost forever, the day my brother died. I do not wish to marry you tomorrow merely because circumstance demands it. I wish to marry you because I love you, entirely and without reservation, and because I cannot imagine facing whatever remains of my life without you steady beside me." Tears spilled freely down Eleanor's cheeks now, unashamed, as she looked down at the man who had once been the most untouchable figure in all of London, kneeling before her with his heart laid bare for anyone to see. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with joy rather than fear this time. "Yes, Alaric. 1,000 times yes." The ballroom erupted into applause, genuine and warm, as he rose and swept her into his arms, and Eleanor understood, in that moment, that the touch which had begun as a desperate act of survival had grown, through honesty and courage, and the slow unraveling of old wounds, into something far greater than either of them could have imagined that first fateful night. Tomorrow, she would become his duchess before family and friends who now understood the truth of their story. Tonight, she simply allowed herself to be held, safe and certain, in the arms of the man she loved. The wedding, when it arrived the following afternoon, bore little resemblance to the anxious, uncertain event Eleanor had feared only days before. The small chapel near the Duke's country estate filled with far more genuine warmth than she had expected, given the scandal that had so recently threatened to consume them both. Lady Beatrice sat in the front pew, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and declaring loudly, to anyone within earshot, that she had known from the very first tea how thoroughly her nephew had fallen. Lord Edmund stood beside Alaric at the altar, his usual easy grin firmly in place, occasionally glancing toward the back of the chapel as though still faintly astonished at how completely the crisis of only days before had resolved itself. Eleanor's father walked her down the narrow aisle with tears he did not bother to hide, his hand trembling slightly in hers, though this time the tremor spoke only of joy rather than the fear that had haunted him for so many months prior. Her sister sat in the second pew, Margaret grinning so widely that Eleanor nearly laughed aloud despite the solemnity the moment demanded, her earlier prediction about improper kisses apparently soon to be proven correct. Alaric watched her approach with an expression she suspected she would remember for the whole of her life, something between disbelief and pure, unguarded joy, as though he still could not quite trust that the woman walking toward him was real and permanent and entirely his own. When she reached him, he took her hand with the same careful gentleness he had shown that very first night, though nothing about his grip trembled now with uncertainty. "You came," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. "I told you," she whispered back. "I do not frighten easily." The ceremony passed in a warm blur of vows, spoken with genuine feeling, rather than the polite formality Eleanor had once expected from a marriage born of practicality. When at last the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Alaric did not wait for permission before drawing her close and kissing her soundly before the entire gathered assembly, drawing a fresh wave of delighted laughter and applause that echoed warmly through the small stone chapel. Outside, As they emerged into the bright afternoon sunlight to the cheers of family and friends gathered on the chapel steps, Eleanor caught sight of a familiar face near the edge of the crowd. Hester stood quietly apart from the main gathering, having been invited at Eleanor's own insistence, a small gesture of gratitude for the courage it had taken to finally speak the truth. She offered Eleanor a shy, uncertain smile, and Eleanor broke briefly from Alaric's side to clasp the woman's hands warmly. "Thank you," Eleanor said, "for finding the courage to make this possible." "Thank you for forgiving me enough to allow it," Hester replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears of her own. As the wedding party made its way toward the estate for the celebration that would follow long into the evening, Alaric drew Eleanor aside for a quiet moment beneath the shade of an ancient oak standing at the edge of the drive, away from the noise and bustle of the gathering crowd. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small velvet box from within his coat. Inside lay a delicate ring, its design far simpler than the grand jewels Eleanor had expected a duke might offer his bride, set instead with a single, modest stone that caught the afternoon light with quiet, understated brilliance. "It was my mother's," he explained, sliding it gently onto her finger alongside the wedding band already resting there. "She wore it every day of her marriage to my father, through every hardship and every joy alike. I can think of no one more deserving of carrying that same steady constancy forward than you." Eleanor turned the ring on her finger, overwhelmed by the simple, sincere weight of the gesture. "It is perfect," she said, "truly." "As are you," he said, and kissed her again, softer this time, a promise rather than a declaration, and Eleanor felt the last remaining shadow of the past week's fear dissolve entirely beneath the warm certainty of his love. 2 years had passed since the night Eleanor first reached for a stranger's arm in a crowded ballroom, and London, ever fickle in its affections, had long since moved on to newer scandals and fresher gossip. What remained, quietly and steadily, was the marriage that scandal had once threatened to destroy before it had properly begun. The Duchess of Ashcombe stood now at the edge of a familiar ballroom, though the grand house belonged to her own husband rather than a distant acquaintance, hosting the very same charity gathering that had once been the site of her greatest fear and, unexpectedly, her greatest fortune. She wore deep blue silk rather than the plain gray muslin of that first night, and the confidence with which she moved through the glittering crowd bore little resemblance to the frightened young woman who had once fled a predatory suitor's grip into the arms of a man the whole of society believed untouchable. Alaric found her near the refreshment table, exactly as he had on so many occasions since their marriage began, though the smile he wore now carried none of the careful reserve that had once defined him. 2 years of genuine happiness had softened the hard lines around his eyes, and the laughter that had once seemed so foreign to him now came easily, often, and entirely without effort. "You are staring again," Eleanor said, echoing words that had become something of a private joke between them over the years. "I am allowed," he replied, just as he always did, drawing her close, despite the watchful eyes of their guests. "I have not yet tired of it, and I do not expect I ever shall." Their circle had grown warmer and wider in the time since Cordelia's scheme had unraveled so publicly. Lady Beatrice remained a constant, beloved presence, doting shamelessly on the couple and, more recently, on the small daughter who had been born to them the previous spring, a dark-haired girl with her father's watchful gray eyes, and her mother's fearless spirit already evident even in infancy. Lord Edmund had married the following year, a cheerful, warm-hearted woman who fit easily into their tight circle of friends, and the four of them had become nearly inseparable, sharing dinners and holidays with the easy comfort of family rather than mere acquaintance. Hester, too, remained connected to their small circle, employed now in a respectable position within the Ashcombe household staff, her past finally behind her, her courage on that difficult night never forgotten by either Eleanor or Alaric. She had become, in her own quiet way, part of the story's happier ending, a woman given a second chance by the very people her earlier choices had once threatened to harm. Of Cordelia Fenwick, little was heard in London society any longer. She had retreated from the Tun entirely within months of the confrontation at the ball, her family's influence unable to fully shield her from the consequences of a cruelty 2 generations of victims had finally exposed to the light. Some said she had gone abroad. Others claimed she remained secluded at her family's country estate, avoided even by those who had once called themselves her closest friends. Eleanor found, to her own quiet surprise, that she carried no lingering bitterness toward the woman whose scheme had so nearly destroyed her happiness. Cordelia's cruelty had, in the end, only strengthened the bond it had been designed to break, and Eleanor could not find it in herself to waste further thought on someone who had chosen, again and again, to build her own unhappiness upon the ruin of others. As the evening's music began, Alaric extended his hand toward his wife with the same formal, deliberate courtesy he had shown that very first night, though the warmth in his eyes now held none of the careful distance that had once defined him. "Might I have this dance, Duchess?" "You need not ask so formally," Eleanor said, smiling as she placed her hand in his. "I believe I have already claimed every dance you have to give, several times over, these past 2 years. Humor me," he said, drawing her close as the music swelled around them. "I find I enjoy asking almost as much as I enjoy your answer." They moved through the steps of the dance with an ease neither of them had possessed that first uncertain night, no longer strangers navigating scandal and suspicion, but partners who had weathered genuine crisis together and emerged stronger for having faced it honestly. Around them, the ballroom watched with none of the shocked whispers that had once accompanied their every public moment together. Instead, there was only warm, familiar affection, the quiet acknowledgement of a couple whose love had long since proven itself far sturdier than the scandal that first brought them together. Near the edge of the dance floor, young Margaret, now grown into a poised young woman of 17 and recently introduced to society herself, watched her sister and brother-in-law with open, unabashed delight. She had never forgotten that late-night conversation years before, when she had asked whether the Duke had kissed her sister, and had been assured, with far more prim propriety than turned out to be entirely necessary, that such things were not permitted before marriage. She caught Eleanor's eye across the room and grinned, and Eleanor, laughing, blew her a small, private kiss that spoke of every private joke and shared secret the two sisters had built between them over the years. Later, as the evening wound toward its close and their guests began to depart in a steady stream of warm farewells, Alaric led Eleanor out onto the estate's quiet terrace, away from the noise and warmth of the ballroom, into the cool hush of the night air. Stars scattered brightly overhead, unobscured by cloud, and somewhere in the house behind them, their daughter slept soundly in the care of a devoted nurse, blissfully unaware of the storm that had once threatened to prevent her very existence. "Do you ever think of that night?" Eleanor asked quietly, leaning against the stone balustrade beside him. "The first one, the ballroom, and Pemberton, and the moment I reached for your arm without thinking." "Often," Alaric admitted, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I think of how close I came to remaining exactly as I was, frozen and guarded, if you had chosen any other man standing in that room that night, or if fear had made you too cautious to reach for anyone at all. I did not choose you," Eleanor reminded him gently. "Not truly, not that first time. I simply reached for the nearest steady thing, and found, quite by accident, precisely the person you were always meant to find," he said, turning to face her fully, his gray eyes soft in the starlight. "I have come to believe there was very little accident in it at all, Eleanor. I believe some part of you recognized something in me that night, even amid your fear, just as some part of me recognized something in you the moment your hand settled on my arm. We simply needed the courage, and the time, to discover what that recognition truly meant." Eleanor rose onto her toes and kissed him softly, unhurried, certain in a way she had never quite managed to be during those anxious early weeks of their courtship. "I am glad," she murmured against his lips, "that I chose to be brave that night, whatever the reason." "As am I," he said, drawing her closer still. "Every single day since, I have been glad of it." They stood together beneath the wide, star-scattered sky, husband and wife, partners who had weathered scandal and grief and betrayal to arrive at this quiet, contented peace, and Eleanor understood, with a certainty that settled deep and warm within her chest, that whatever challenges life still held in store for them, they would face every one of them exactly as they had faced Cordelia's cruel scheme 2 years before, together, honestly, and without fear. The ballroom behind them fell gradually silent as the last of their guests departed, but neither Eleanor nor Alaric moved to return inside, content instead to remain exactly where they were, wrapped in each other's arms beneath the quiet, endless night. No longer strangers reaching desperately for safety, but two people who had finally, fully, found their way home to one another. Inside, a lone servant moving quietly through the darkened corridors paused at a window overlooking the terrace and smiled at the sight of the Duke and Duchess still standing together beneath the stars, unwilling to let the evening end. It had become something of a familiar sight among the household staff over the past 2 years, this quiet devotion between two people who might so easily have parted ways at the first sign of hardship, and who had chosen, again and again, to remain instead. The following morning brought its usual gentle chaos to the Ashcombe household, their small daughter waking with the sun and demanding attention with the particular insistence of a child who had inherited her mother's fearless determination in full measure. Eleanor found her husband already in the nursery when she arrived, seated on the floor in his shirt sleeves, entirely undignified by any measure the ton might have recognized, allowing their daughter to tug at his dark hair with gleeful abandon. "She has your stubbornness," Eleanor observed from the doorway, smiling at the sight. "She has your courage," Alaric countered, glancing up with an easy warmth that still, after 2 years, occasionally caught Eleanor by surprise. So different was it from the guarded stranger she had first met. "I suspect that will prove the more troublesome inheritance, in time." "Troublesome how?" "I imagine," he said, catching their daughter as she toppled sideways with a delighted shriek, "that she will grow into a young woman, entirely unafraid to reach for whatever, or whoever, she believes she needs, regardless of what society deems proper. I find I cannot entirely regret the prospect, though I suspect it will earn me a great many gray hairs before she is grown." Eleanor crossed the room and settled beside them both on the nursery floor, laughing as their daughter immediately transferred her determined attention to tugging at her mother's carefully arranged hair instead. "Then she will simply have to learn, as I did, that reaching for the right person makes all the difference in how such boldness turns out." "A lesson I am endlessly grateful you learned in time," Alaric said, catching Eleanor's free hand in his own, and pressing a warm kiss to her knuckles, exactly as he had done that very first week of their acquaintance, when honesty between them had still felt new and fragile, rather than the deep settled foundation it had since become. Later that week, a letter arrived from Lord Edmund, inviting the family to spend the coming summer at his own newly acquired country estate, an invitation Eleanor accepted with genuine delight, already looking forward to long afternoons spent in easy company with friends who had stood beside them through the very worst of their trials. She thought, often, of how different her life had become from the anxious, uncertain existence she had known before that fateful ballroom encounter, how thoroughly one desperate, unplanned gesture had rewritten the entire course of her future. She did not regret a single moment of the difficulty that had followed, not the scandal, not Cordelia's cruelty, not even the brief, agonizing days when she had feared losing Alaric entirely to doubt and old grief. Each trial, she had come to understand, had only proven the strength of what they had built together, testing it and tempering it until it emerged sturdier and more certain than anything built on ease alone could ever have become. She had reached for a stranger's arm out of fear that first night, uncertain of what she might find. 2 years later, standing in the warm, chaotic happiness of her own nursery, surrounded by a husband who no longer needed to guard his heart against her, and a daughter who had inherited the very courage that had brought her parents together, Eleanor understood at last exactly what she had found, and she would not have traded it for any fortune, any title, or any safer, more predictable life the world might have offered her instead.